On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, the streets of Dallas, Texas, were filled with excitement as crowds lined up to catch a glimpse of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and his wife Jacqueline, who were passing through the city in a motorcade. The atmosphere was vibrant, with cheering spectators eager to witness the charismatic leader. However, as the motorcade turned from North Houston Street onto Elm Street, the excitement quickly turned to shock. Suddenly, the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the air, followed by two more rapid shots. Panic erupted as people scrambled in every direction, and the motorcade sped away, its passengers now victims of an unthinkable attack. President Kennedy, critically wounded, was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but by 1:00 p.m., the world would be forever changed. The news came through the airwaves. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, had been assassinated. The nation, gripped by disbelief and grief, immediately launched a manhunt for the suspected assassin, identified as Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald, a former employee of the Texas School Book Depository, was believed to have fired the fatal shots from the building's 6th floor. Within hours, Oswald was arrested and later charged with the crime. The shocking events that unfolded that day would alter the course of American history, forever immortalizing November 22nd, 1963, as a day of national tragedy, conspiracy theories, and the loss of a beloved leader. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on October 18, 1939, in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a family marked by tragedy and instability. His father, Robert Oswald, died of a heart attack just 2 months before he was born, leaving his mother, Marguerite, to raise him and his 2 older brothers alone. Marguerite, struggling financially, was forced to constantly adapt to her circumstances, but no matter how many times she moved or tried to make ends meet, the family's financial difficulties persisted. Despite the hardships, Marguerite's determination to provide for her children remained unwavering. She sold their house, bought a smaller one, and opened a small shop selling gifts and sewing supplies. However, her business venture failed, and she was soon forced to sell the house and move again. Marguerite's parenting, marked by emotional neglect and constant instability, had a profound effect on her children, especially Lee. While Marguerite tried to balance work and caring for her children, she couldn't provide the stability they needed. The pressure mounted as she struggled to care for Lee. In an attempt to ease the burden, she sent her 2 older sons to a Catholic boarding school, but young Lee, too young to be sent away, remained with her. He quickly became known as a solitary, angry child, prone to violent outbursts. Lee's behavior was unpredictable, leaving many to question the effect that his tumultuous environment had on his mental state. Despite brief moments of kindness from his Aunt Lillian, who saw a gentler side of him, Lee continued to grow more isolated and emotionally disconnected from his mother. His volatile relationship with Marguerite became more strained as time passed, and Lee became increasingly resentful. Marguerite, for her part, was deeply overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising her children alone. She never seemed to connect with Lee in a meaningful way, which deepened his feelings of abandonment and alienation. This lack of support and care in his formative years set the stage for the bitterness and violence that would later define his life. From a young age, Lee Harvey Oswald's educational journey was marked by a struggle and social isolation. Although he showed intellectual promise, his academic performance was hindered by his difficulty with reading and spelling. These struggles, compounded by undiagnosed dyslexia, made school a frustrating experience for him. By the time he reached the 4th grade, his teachers took note of his challenges, but also recognized his potential. Despite his cognitive ability, Lee's social life remained disjointed and fragmented as he lacked the social skills to connect with his peers. His isolation deepened as he became more withdrawn and increasingly frustrated. Teachers and classmates noted his tendency to act out, with Lee often resorting to violence when angered. One of his former teachers recalled incidents where Lee had lashed out, even breaking his mother's chandelier during one particularly angry outburst. His violent tendencies became a defining trait, and while his aunt, Lillian, described him as a sweet child when he was with her, he remained emotionally unstable when at home with his mother. Lee's social circle was minimal. He did not make friends easily and preferred to spend time alone, reading comics or immersing himself in solitary activities. His mother's disinterest in his emotional well-being further deepened his sense of loneliness. Marguerite's inability to provide the emotional support Lee needed meant that he was left to navigate his emotional world alone. While his brothers were sent off to military school, Lee remained behind, often with no one to turn to for comfort or guidance. His deteriorating mental state went unnoticed by those around him. The lack of intervention during these formative years contributed to the emotional isolation that would shape Lee's later actions. Though his teachers attempted to provide him with the attention he needed, the deeper issues at play, such as his anger, resentment, and social detachment, went unaddressed. The boy who had shown promise in his early education was now a young man struggling to understand his place in the world. As Lee Harvey Oswald entered his teenage years, his isolation from society deepened, and his anger began to manifest in more destructive ways. Now, a young man, Oswald's internal world was consumed by frustration and confusion. His family's instability, combined with the personal neglect he had experienced, left him with a profound sense of alienation. With few friends to turn to, and no emotional support from his mother, Oswald increasingly turned to radical political ideology to make sense of his tumultuous life. Around the age of 15, Lee began to immerse himself in Marxist literature. He found solace in the works of Karl Marx, particularly Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. These revolutionary ideas gave him a framework for understanding the injustices he saw in the world, particularly the inequalities in American society. He became deeply dissatisfied with the capitalist system that he believed oppressed the working class, including his own family. Marxism, with its promise of social change and equality, appealed to Oswald's desire for a greater purpose. By the time Oswald was 16, his ideology had become a driving force in his life. He began to express his political views more openly, engaging in heated debates and alienating those around him. His neighbors and family members grew frustrated with his constant arguments and his confrontational attitude. Lee's view of the world had shifted dramatically. He now saw himself as a part of a larger struggle, fighting against an unjust system. His personality, already prone to anger, became more volatile as he clung to his radical beliefs. His relationship with his family, especially with his mother, deteriorated further during this period. Marguerite, who had never been emotionally supportive, now seemed increasingly frustrated with Lee's behavior. His mother's failure to acknowledge or understand his ideological transformation made him feel even more disconnected from her. To Lee, his family represented everything that was wrong with America, the capitalist, consumer-driven society that he despised. His radical views began to dominate his thinking, and by the time he was 17, Oswald had reached a breaking point. He decided that the only way to escape the limitations of his life was to defect to the Soviet Union. The ideological pull of communism and his dissatisfaction with the United States became so powerful that he was willing to leave everything behind in search of a new life, where he believed he could make a meaningful difference. In 1956, seeking a sense of purpose and discipline, Lee Harvey Oswald enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. The military offered him an escape from his fractured home life and a chance to prove himself. Despite his initial promise, particularly excelling in marksmanship and ranking as a sharpshooter, Oswald's rebellious nature soon surfaced. His disdain for authority and a dissatisfaction with military life led him to make a series of poor decisions. He was court-martialed twice during his time in the Marines, once for possession of an unauthorized firearm and another time for insubordination. Though Oswald initially sought stability and structure in the military, his time in the Marines only deepened his sense of alienation and reinforced his growing radicalism. The military, like every other institution he had encountered, failed to meet his expectations and fueled his bitterness towards American society. By 1959, disillusioned with both the military and his life in America, Oswald began contemplating a drastic course of action, defecting to the Soviet Union. Oswald had already been studying the Russian language, and his ideological commitment to Marxism made him feel aligned with Soviet ideals. In October 1959, at the age of 20, Oswald applied for a hardship discharge from the Marine Corps, claiming his mother needed his financial support. With his discharge approved, Oswald left the United States, traveling first to France before moving on to the Soviet Union. Upon arriving in Moscow, Oswald's idealism collided with reality. He was eager to renounce his American citizenship and become a Soviet citizen, hoping to escape the capitalistic world he so despised. However, the Soviet authorities were skeptical of this young American defector. They questioned his motives, and, after a brief hospital stay, following an attempted suicide, ultimately decided to grant him temporary residency in the Soviet Union. Oswald was sent to Minsk, where he was provided with a job at an electronics factory and a modest apartment. Though his life in the Soviet Union was relatively comfortable, it was not the utopian society he had imagined. Over time, the harsh realities of Soviet life began to wear on him. He became increasingly disillusioned with the regime, which he had once idealized, and began to feel trapped in a system that did not live up to his expectations. By 1961, Lee Harvey Oswald's disillusionment with life in the Soviet Union was growing. He had hoped for a better, more meaningful existence in a society that aligned with his beliefs, but instead, he found himself struggling with the rigidity of Soviet life. Despite his government-provided job and apartment in Minsk, Oswald became increasingly resentful of the system he had once admired. The dream of revolutionary change that had motivated him to leave the United States was now replaced by a sense of alienation and frustration. In 1962, Oswald made a bold decision to leave the Soviet Union and return to America, despite the risk of being viewed as a traitor. With the Soviet government's reluctant approval, he departed Minsk and traveled to the U.S. via Poland and Finland, arriving back in New York in the spring of 1962. He was accompanied by his Russian wife, Marina, whom he had married in 1961, and their infant daughter, June. Upon his return, Oswald expected to be welcomed as a figure of intrigue, a symbol of defection from the capitalist West to the communist East. However, the reality was far from what he had imagined. Life in America was difficult. The public was more interested in his story than his actual presence, and Oswald quickly became disillusioned with the lack of support from both his country and the Soviet Union. Oswald's relationship with Marina was strained from the beginning. The young couple struggled to adjust to their new life in America, and Oswald's temper and sense of entitlement only added to the tension. His sense of failure deepened as he bounced from job to job, unable to settle down or build a stable life for his family. His political convictions, once the driving force in his life, now seemed hollow, leaving Oswald feeling lost and without purpose. As Oswald's discontent with both the Soviet Union and his return to the United States deepened, he became increasingly consumed by radical political beliefs. His growing alienation from society and his sense of failure in achieving any meaningful change led him to embrace more extreme actions. By early 1963, Oswald had become increasingly involved with left-wing political causes, including pro-Castro groups that advocated for the Cuban Revolution. Despite his deepening radicalization, he felt increasingly disconnected from mainstream political movements and sought more direct methods of making an impact. Oswald's obsession with global politics and his desire to make a mark on history took a violent turn. In the spring of 1963, Oswald attempted to assassinate General Edwin Walker, a right-wing activist and former U.S. Army general, whom he saw as a symbol of everything he despised about American society. Oswald's failed attempt to kill Walker marked a crucial moment in his descent into violence. Although the assassination attempt was unsuccessful, it further demonstrated Oswald's willingness to take extreme measures to bring attention to his radical political beliefs. By the summer of 1963, Oswald had set his sights on a far more significant target, President John F. Kennedy. His obsession with making a lasting impact on history reached its peak with the announcement that Kennedy would visit Dallas in November 1963. Oswald, now working at the Texas School Book Depository, realized that the motorcade would pass directly by the building, providing him with a perfect opportunity to strike. He meticulously planned the assassination, purchasing a rifle under a false name, and even practicing with it. Oswald's deep-seated resentment and frustration with his own life, his failures, and the inequalities he saw in the world likely fueled his decision to kill Kennedy. Oswald, who had always struggled to be seen and remembered, believed that this violent act would finally make him a historical figure, a man whose name would live on in infamy. On the morning of November 22, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald's long-planned assassination of President John F. Kennedy unfolded in Dealey Plaza, Dallas. As Kennedy's motorcade made its way through the city, thousands of onlookers lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the president. Oswald, positioned on the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository, had the perfect vantage point. He hid behind stacks of boxes and waited for the moment to strike. When the president's motorcade turned onto Elm Street, Oswald fired 3 shots from his rifle. The first bullet struck President Kennedy in the upper back, exiting through his throat and wounding Texas Governor John Connally, who was sitting in front of the president. The second shot missed its target entirely, but the third bullet struck Kennedy in the back of the head, causing him to slump forward, fatally injured. As the motorcade sped away, chaos ensued, and witnesses in the crowd screamed in horror. Oswald quickly hid the rifle and fled the scene. Within minutes, law enforcement officers began arriving at the scene, and Oswald's name was circulated as a suspect. But by that time, he had already left the building. His actions had just shocked the nation, and he was now on the run. Later, Oswald's co-workers testified that they had heard the unmistakable sound of the gunshots and witnessed the aftermath, confirming that the shots came from the 6th floor. The entire nation, gripped by disbelief and sorrow, awaited the news of the president's condition. By 1:00 p.m., the nation learned of the tragic death of President John F. Kennedy. The assassination sent shockwaves through the country. As Oswald's name was broadcast on the radio and television, a massive manhunt ensued. Law enforcement quickly connected Oswald to the murder of a police officer, J.D. Tippit, who was shot just hours after the assassination. Tippit had stopped Oswald for questioning, and Oswald responded by gunning him down in cold blood. As the police scoured the city for the suspect, Oswald's whereabouts were traced. He was eventually arrested in a movie theater after a tense standoff with officers. Throughout his arrest, Oswald maintained his innocence regarding Kennedy's assassination, even though overwhelming evidence pointed to him as the killer. He confessed to the murder of Officer Tippit, but denied any involvement in the death of Kennedy, stating, "I'm just a patsy." Oswald's arrest and the subsequent investigation brought the nation's focus to him. However, just 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred from the city jail to the county jail, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped forward from the crowd of reporters and shot Oswald in the abdomen. The killing was broadcast live on television, adding another layer of shock to the already traumatic event. Oswald died shortly after being shot by Ruby, and his death effectively silenced him, leaving many unanswered questions. Was Oswald really the lone gunman, or did others play a role in the assassination? Theories about conspiracy abound, but the truth remains elusive. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy marked a pivotal moment in American history. The shock and grief of his death resonated not just across the United States, but around the world. The subsequent events surrounding Lee Harvey Oswald's life, arrest, and murder by Jack Ruby fueled conspiracy theories that continue to captivate the public. Despite the findings of the Warren Commission, which concluded that Oswald acted alone, many continue to doubt this conclusion, raising questions about the possibility of a larger conspiracy. Oswald's motives for killing Kennedy remain unclear. Some speculate it was driven by his deep political beliefs, while others suggest a more personal and psychological crisis. Lee Harvey Oswald's tragic and violent path from a troubled childhood to an infamous assassin highlights the complexity of his character and the forces that shaped his decisions. His story and the unanswered questions surrounding his actions have continued to provoke debate for over half a century. In the end, Oswald's life and his actions remain one of the most scrutinized and debated aspects of 20th century history. His name is forever linked to the assassination of one of the most beloved American presidents, and though the details of his life and motivations may never be fully understood, his impact on history is undeniable.